Thank you. And I'm real tickled to be here. I'm real honored. And what I've done, I have a PowerPoint and it keeps me on track. And it's a modification of a talk I gave recently to the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And it'll flow like this. First, for those of you who don't know what the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act is, it'll give you some background, what some accomplishments are, what some remaining problems are. And then I'll talk about myself a bit and what I'm doing and how I think regarding some of these problems. So I hope it's not too basic uh, for many of you, it may be, but we'll see how it goes here. I'm going to share my screen. Um, okay. Let me get all this stuff off my screen so I can see what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. Oh, okay. Well, shoot. Let me go back. Okay. I'm trying to get the people off the screen, all y'all, so I can see. Oh, here it is. Oh no, but now I lost the share. Dagnabbit.
Oh, we can still see your
Yeah, but I can't. That was the thing. Okay. So many people when they give talks start out with a land acknowledgement. I don't. Sometimes I do, it all depends. And I have some problems with land acknowledgements, which I'll get to later, mostly because they're necessary but not sufficient in talking about reparations to Native people. But I do like to start out a bit in remembrance of some of the practitioners that I worked with. Many others have passed on since NAGPRA became law in 1990, but some of you may recognize some of these names, the wonderful individuals who were very dedicated to NAGPRA work. So what is NAGPRA? Where are we after nearly 35 years? And here's a law that was passed in 1990, and it was supposed to be done in 5 years, according to the statute. And here we still are 35 years later. And on top of that, I'm still doing it. And I was hired as an Andeanist. I had worked as a clerk typist at Field Museum after my undergraduate. I was really excited to be at Field Museum because it's one of the coolest museums there is. But sitting in my little desk in a room that was full of the smell of pesticides, and then I would wonder, why are there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of moccasins and pipes and human remains? And it just kind of turned me off from museums. And I was right next to a cabinet where Franz Boas's papers were stored from his work with the early years of the field with Chicago. So it's like, I don't want to be an archaeologist. I don't want to work in museums. I'm going to work with people in Ecuador. And that's another long story how I got there. And then when I was chair of the anthropology department the first time, NAGPRA landed in my lap. And so I'm still at it, but I'm still working in Ecuador. So what is NAGPRA? NAGPRA is a result, there are those who say that NAGPRA is fundamentalism. It goes against church and state, or it's just politics. But what NAGPRA is a statute, which I believe to be the most powerful human rights statute that has taken hold in the United States. It's a response to many things that are ongoing, and they're worse than ever now as a result of this election. And so I don't want to I'll go off here and there, but the Indian wars that have never ended, the countless discrimination, poverty, and I guess fortunately there are some television programs that people are watching now, like Reservation Dogs and Dark Winds and so forth, and what Ken Burns has done, where it's just unbelievable to me how many people I know come up and go, I didn't know this about Native people. I didn't know that. So the education continues, but there's still dehumanizing representations. I love the Kansas City Chiefs, but really, you know, um, and there's still illegal trafficking and thoughtless academic research still continues. So hence, because of all this, which is ongoing in the history of this continent, Public Law 101-601 was passed in November of 1990. Basically, what NAGPRA says is that any institution that's ever received federal funding of any kind gets classified as a museum under the law. Doesn't matter if you have an actual museum facility, you become a federal museum. And therefore, you have to abide by what is essential to NAGPRA, which is consultation and repatriation for the most part. Not all museums have demonstrated the institutional will. There have been decades of delays. A lot of work is still to be done. But it's part of broader work on reparations, reconciliation, decolonization. Something that's not well understood is that although NAGPRA is specific to the United States, it's principally an indigenous human rights law. It's not a national preservation or a conservation law. And so therefore it really, and this is, preservation laws place restrictions on objects of antiquity and historic objects. Instead, what NAGPRA does, and this is a quote from Tim McEwen, who worked with the Park Service and just stepped off as on the National NAGPRA Committee, NAGPRA transfers complete control of certain Native American cultural items to lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or Native Hawaiians to do with as they see fit. Therefore, this is a matter of sovereignty, and this isn't just a matter of conservation. So therefore, it's a kind of restorative justice, and it falls under international conventions. So, for instance, the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 11, states that Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, which is what's going on with people I'm working with in Ecuador who live in the city. So they have the right to protect archaeological and historical sites. And it's English spelling when you pull this off the web. So artifacts and practice and so forth. This is how it is on the international site. And then what's more specific to NAGPRA per se is that they have the right to develop and teach spiritual and religious traditions, but on the last line here, the right to the repatriation of human remains. So NAGPRA, it's a US law, it applies to the US context only, but it has the force of international convention behind it. So the central features of NAGPRA, people say, and it's got complications, lots of moving parts, but there's really three things. Documentation of collections. So what do you have in a collection? So every institution's required to produce a summary, and a summary can be one paragraph. That's about what it was with Fort Lewis College when we produced it in 1990. It wasn't quite, we have a lot of stuff and some of it might be native, but that's a summary. We have a lot of items that may be of interest to Native people, and we have collections that come from this area and that area. You can say it kind of generally, but you have to document. You have to let tribal people know and the federal government know what you have. Then to narrow it down, what might be affiliated with particular people so that they can make a repatriation claim, you have to consult with Native Americans. Consultation is at the center. So decisions regarding who is affiliated, what tribal people are affiliated with what human remains and items, this can only happen on the basis of consultation. Museums cannot sit and go, I think it's mostly the Puebloan people, and therefore we're going to leave the Navajos out of discussion. Tribal people have to come in, and tribal people are the ones to make the decision. So what gets repatriated? These are the categories under the law. Something called sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, funerary objects that have been separated from human remains, and then ancestral human remains and associated funerary objects. And then there's some other details, as was the case with Fort Lewis College. We had a collection of 40, they're called MNI, minimum number of individuals, for whom we didn't have enough information, and on the basis of consultation, tribes couldn't say who they were affiliated with, who they belonged to. And so there's a process by which, if it's fairly well certain that they're indigenous because of provenience and all sorts of other things, they can then be taken, disposition can go to a tribe or tribes. And that's what happened at Fort Lewis. Cultural affiliation, then how is that decided? And this is where it becomes very interesting anthropologically. Although I was real ticked off that I had to start doing this, it's like, as I was saying, like, I didn't go into archaeology and museum work for reasons. And here it's on my lap, and I have to apply for a grant. And my colleague Phil Duke and I applied for a grant, got the college's first grant. But in making a decision about whether a set of human remains, one human remain, any objects might or might not be affiliated with a certain tribal nation, a culture, there are 10 factors in the law, and they're equally weighed. One is not more important than another, but there are those who will argue till they're blue in the face, like biological is most important, and whatever the osteologist says, that's what go. Nah, no. All of these are equally weighted. The weird thing is, if you go and Google cultural affiliation criteria, only only 9 of these come up, not 10. And the one that's missing is anthropological. So I've been on a rampage about this. Like, what does that mean? And it seems like that somebody's decided enough to where it's not available. AI won't find anthropological. It lists 8 or other information. But it's like, well, nobody really knows what anthropological means. So you've got your biology, you got your linguistics, you got your archaeology. What is? And to me, anthropological is the process of pulling it all together meaningfully, which is another line of evidence, but I digress. So some good things have happened since I started working in the 90s, where I worked in a silo. Nobody would talk to me. And this is long, like I caught a lot of crap for working on NAGPRA because it's like, you're not an archaeologist, you're not a museum person, you're not a Southwest specialist. What in the world are you doing? It's like somebody's got to do something, and it's the law, and I'm department chair, so I've got to get on this. But I was pretty much in a silo, and I was pushed aside, and the archaeologist told me, we've got this, we'll finish it. So I went ahead and I wrote a book about NAGPRA, and I went back to work in Ecuador, and it turned out the archaeologists didn't do anything. They didn't finish it up. So I had to come back in 2014 and start raising hell again. But one good thing that happened is that these communities of practice have grown up just in the past fewer than 10 years. So there's the National Community of Practice that Anna Motti founded. She's worked in the Museum Studies program at University of Denver. She got this amazing program that is still going. Every 2 Fridays a week, we meet online, 150 people sometimes, 75 people sometime. And as Tim mentioned, I'm on the committee of 3 people who get speakers for this, but it's people getting on to see, like, am I being gaslighted? I'm being told that this couldn't possibly be a tribe we should consult with, or this couldn't possibly be a kind of evidence we should look at. And my administration is telling me to get this done, which is what happened to me. It's like, how soon? Every time I met with the president, how soon this going to be done? How soon he thought I was just dragging my feet or something. But these communities of practice are amazing. And there's one for the Southeast, the Southwest. There's one for California. I think there's one in Wisconsin that's trying to get going. But this is where people come together. And I sit on as many of these as possible because I'm revising my book right now for Nebraska. And of course, the main topic of conversation right now is, how do we do NAGPRA when the federal government is imploding? And the person I mentioned, Anna Motti, who got this brilliant idea going with an IMLS grant, she then left DU to be head of NAGPRA for the Bureau of Land Management, and she was fired illegally and has no job now. And then another thing that happened that was good, there was several years ago, and this actually happened before the communities of practice, but NSF had an ethics initiative. And so one big project within the National Science Foundation initiative was something called Learning NAGPRA. And I participated in this. It was based at Indiana University. So April Seaver was at Indiana University, and she worked with Jesse Riker Crawford, who's the dean at Institute of American Indian Arts. But lots of conversations and lots of resources regarding how do we train students? This is where it comes into the academy. How do we train people, especially Native people, to do NAGPRA work? So at the centerpiece of NAGPRA is consultation, and knowledge from descendant communities is central. And so, as I've said before, cultural affiliation decisions come down to wisdom of people within descendant communities. They are cultural, they're social, they're functional, they're relational, they're intentional, all these sorts of things we work with in anthropology. And I find it interesting too, and I'll say a little bit more later, but cultural affiliation decisions to me, they're at the intersection of philosophical axes of ontology, epistemology, ethics, and axiology. NAGPRA, again, it's not hierarchically archaeological or bioanthropological. We need social sciences, we need humanities. It's not a STEM field. And so this, I'm going to come back to this, but this is one of the things that I'm constantly speaking about is that people tend to think, oh, you can get trained to be a practitioner if you can learn to identify a human bone from a dog bone. Oh, it's way more than that. So I mentioned the new regulations, there are previous regulations. So, you know, a law is like a policy, and then there are procedures, right, with policies. Well, regulations with federal law are like the procedures of how to do the law. And there were lots of problems with the 2 or 3 sets of previous ones. And so the new regulations were just passed in 2024 after massive consultation and public comment. And so the new regulations do many things to reset some of the original intentions of Congress, but much more of the burden of compliance falls to museums. It was supposed to be that way in the beginning because what preceded NAGPRA in 1990 was the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which had no teeth at all. It meant that if tribes wanted to complain about, I don't know, the sleeping Ute mountain they'd have to go and make a statement and say there's something sacred on a mountain, and they'd have to violate their privacy and they'd have to come forward. And so we didn't do much with it. So to me, NAGPRA is a continuation and an improvement of the 1978 AIRFA, American Indian Religious Freedom Act. I also think it's a continuation of the ghost dance. But museums have deadlines now. Associated funerary objects must be repatriated. They weren't before. And what's most important is on the bottom here, important in the sense that museums are spending most attention and anxiety over this right now, that the new regulations have a significant aspect called duty of care. So that's 43 CFR Part 10. Duty of care means that there's explicit language now. The NAGPRA is not only purely about repatriation, but it's about caring, safeguarding, preserving any ancestral remains or belongings in the possession or control of federal museums. And that involves 3 things: consulting with, so now when you mount a museum exhibit, you have to consult with the corresponding tribal nation or Hawaiian organization regarding what you're going to put in the exhibit, what you're going to say about it. Before, that was not a requirement. And you have to make as good faith effort as you can to incorporate and accommodate Native American information and get free and prior and informed consent regarding not only museum exhibitions, museum storage practices, but any kind of research that people request. NAGPRA doesn't require research, and in fact, destructive research is prohibited under NAGPRA. So duty of care, CFR 10 is explicit about this. So what are some of the accomplishments? Oops. Oh, that was right. Whoops, I went way back. So as of the National NAGPRA of the National Park Service late in the last fall gave me some information, and this is, I'm not going to read this out loud to you, but in the past 5 years or so, they've made much more progress than in the previous 30 years. So some of it is just, much of it is due to community of practice, the awareness and the pressure that was put on museums. So for instance, I went to visit a friend who lives in Vermont in a little town of Panton, and she was on the board of this teeny museum there. And because she knew me, she mentioned to the director, you know, we have some Native American items. And so I came and did some like consultation with them, and they had lots of items from all over. And had my friend not known I was working in this, that museum would not have gotten its act together to do NAGPRA compliance. So there's still many museums that haven't done their work. So since 1990, this is the number of human remains that have been reported. And what's important is reported, meaning you, in these summaries that you send in, you report, but this is why NAGPRA is probably never going to end, because many more items come into museums. Museums are just these nested dolls of holdings and boxes that are not well marked, and items keep showing up and keep coming forward. But at least, so the National Park Service bases its statistics on what is reported. So as of September, 90,000 and some human remains are still pending consultation and or notice of what have been reported. So 58% of those reported have completed the NAGPRA process, meaning that legal control is passed on to tribal people who made repatriation claims. That doesn't necessarily mean reburial has happened, because then agreements get made between, if the tribe, for instance, says right now we don't have a good burial spot, we don't have a good museum spot, they'll enter into agreements with museums to take care. And we did that with a collection with Pueblo of Acoma. But down here, 43% of the museums subject to NAGPRA, the calculation, still have not completed the process. And so as of September 2024, these were the worst offenders, even though the Ohio History Connection repatriated a great many. The tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, had to buy back items from the Ohio History Connection. But these were the ones that still had the most items that need to be resolved. So what's contributed to delays and foot dragging? Now, there's problems with the statute. Those are very hard to change because it means a new law. Problems with regulations. Those can be changed. And as I said, many of the problems have been addressed in the new set of regulations. Problems with the federal government, like, of what I speak. Problems within academic disciplines. There's still this idea within the academy that the finds from archaeological sites or museum holdings are personal property of certain tenured professors. And that by interfering with research, one is violating academic freedom. So there's those kinds of problems. There's also institutional racism problems within institutions, that they may say, yes, we want to do NAGPRA, we're on it, let's get a grant. And so these problems are being solved not by restructuring existing budget structures to have people who are trained, who work in this, but just by doing soft money and then hoping it'll go away. Lots of problems with museums and the continued colonization and colonizing mentalities of museums. And partly some of it's really good faith. Museum practitioners are perfectionists, and they don't even want to create summaries of what they have until it's like, oh, I want to be, they want to be perfectionists about it, but they have to stop. And then the barriers to action. And I think the biggest barrier is problems with thinking, how we think, how we conceptualize all this to keep going. So, some of these are lack of will, lack of creativity, lack of understanding the role of history and the nature of ongoing colonization practices, and even presentism, like declaring all things from the past are wrong based on present day standards. That can also be a problem in looking at the past, doing something about it, and so forth. So I want to switch to a little bit to the work that I did. This was the kind of thing, Fort Lewis College, its first, I guess you call him a curator. There was this minister, Methodist minister, Homer Root, who decided when he retired from being a minister that he wanted to be an archaeologist. So this whole thing of amateur archaeology is rampant in the US as it's part of the beginning of the Mormon church. Joseph Smith, those people out on the East Coast, Frank Cushing, they were really into finding artifacts and having spiritual connections with Native people. And it's kind of fascinating and something someday, if I can write a book, I'm really interested in the gray area between amateur and academic archaeology. I don't think it's real clear cut, and I think amateur archaeologists have been scapegoats for the work that anyway. I won't go. That's a whole nother talk. But anyway, this guy Homer Root, this minister, this is his handwriting. He made these massive ledger books, humongous, where he drew and described all of the holdings that were in this, what was called the Center of Southwest Studies at Fort Lewis College. Now, many of these he had looted his own self, and others had looted, but here's this record. And he taught archaeological field schools at the college. Now, as we started doing NAGPRA work, I think this particular vessel, number 35, which I wouldn't have shown because it's a burial vessel, but it cannot be found. It's just gone. Lots of belongings went walking. And so the NAGPRA work that we had to start doing at Fort Lewis was a matter of archival work, consultation, and so forth, and then doing osteological analyses. So we had our first big consultation was in 1996. And then the director of the Center of Southwest Studies and myself got another NAGPRA grant, the college's second one in 2017. And this was some of the people who participated on the first day of consultation back in 2018. And just lots of great people here who are students and from nearby tribes and so forth, and museum practitioners. This guy here in the back, in the black shirt, he was in my critical museum and heritage studies class. And he is from Cheyenne River tribe. And he was I didn't know him. He raised his hand. I told him I'd worked at Field Museum, and he wanted to know when Field Museum was going to repatriate the Tyrannosaurus Rex named Sue back to his tribe because it was taken illegally from their land. And now he is the he's a collections manager of History Colorado and runs NAGPRA for the state of Colorado. So the things one is happy about with one's students. Here's some other students. These are with the Isleta del Sur war captain and his crew when they came for consultation, and these from the Pueblo of Zuni. And unfortunately, one of these individuals is no longer with us because of COVID. So why has somebody like me had developed a career-long interest? I'm a non-native, I'm not a non-museum specialist, I'm not archaeologist, I'm a feminist, historical, sociocultural, Andean ethnographer. And I've listed everything down here, but I owe my job, I owe my career, I owe my livelihood. I owe having my husband I have because I worked at Fort Lewis to First Nations peoples and the land that I'm sitting on. And I know where our house is along a river. This was a common place where Ute people came and camped. I find NAGPRA fascinating. It's not just a law, it's a cultural trope. It's a dense signal. It's like if somebody from Mars wanted to know about the United States and they only had a week, it's like study NAGPRA. You'll find out a lot about this country. NAGPRA is at the intersection of personal and political, citizen and state, sacred and profane, reform and revolution. I find that fascinating. It draws attention to racialized and racist and sexist underpinnings of institutions. So it's very much sociology to do NAGPRA. NAGPRA compliance points to the importance of doing radical rethinking of how structures in the institutions are put together and why historical awareness of those histories is important. And finally, NAGPRA links, it crosses the globe in conversations about justice, reparations, and accountability. And I think I'm skipping so I put just like here's my biography, and so like I'm not going to go over this here, but I'm half Macedonian, and I know where, and I've always wondered though, like why didn't I get into the history of these people? My mother, we know the village they're from, Balkan Wars. I've just been more attached to Native American histories from what I've tried. And then I just put the names of some of my professors because some of you might have known these people: John Terrell, John Collier, John White, and David Blanchard at the Field Museum, and all these people at University of Illinois, and so forth. And this is my most recent book, Dynamics of Urban Indigeneity and Urban Context. And one of the cool things about doing NAGPRA is that in Ecuador, my students in Ecuador wanted to know about North American Native people and South American natives. There's growing interest in repatriation of human remains right now at the University of San Francisco, Quito, who's publishing my book. One of the publishers, a woman there, Maria Patricia Ordonez, she did her PhD work at in Europe, going around to the Pitt Rivers museums and the British Museum to see what shrunken heads they have in their control, which are the belongings of South American Native people, the tropical forest. And so she gave a NAGPRA talk, and it was so cool because nobody could believe I hired somebody. It's like, well, she doesn't do North American Native work. It's like, yeah, but all y'all need to know there's Native people south of the border. And there were people who came on the call, like from the Brooklyn Museum, and said, we didn't know who to talk to, and we have belongings of the Shuar people of Ecuador, so made a connection there across borders. I also wrote a paper on a human being known as Esther, who was displayed for many years at Mesa Verde National Park, even though she didn't come from that park. And I wrote with a student about that. So to kind of tie things up here, NAGPRA, as I said before, it's about cultures, meanings, structures of power, and uneven relationships. And it's very centered on axiology, which is key to Sean Wilson, who's a Cree academic, Canadian academic. He wrote a book called Research as Ceremony, saying that relationships are central to conducting research, and the same kind of rules of etiquette and respect you follow when you go eat at your family home for Hanukkah or whatever. You need to follow those when conducting research. When you break those rules, there's epistemological violence that happens, and epistemic violence, which is when knowledge, the bases for knowledge, are thrown out, thrown away, dismissed, erased, which is part of what the reaction is right now to the history of anthropology and people dismissing and throwing out Boaz's work and so forth. Well, that has gone. This is, I think it's wrong whenever it happens, but it's happened much more, and it's happening again. It's this kind of violence to knowledge that's happening on a national level here. And I see as epistemic violence, like when you analyze a human remain, but you don't try to situate the knowledge in the history of that person, the history of the acquisition of that person, the other lines of evidence, linguistic, kinship, so forth. And that's a kind of violence. So NAGPRA is about language, culture, and power, and part of that has to do with emotion. And there's a lot of conversation going on, and we're giving a paper at the SAA meetings. Chance, I showed you the guy in the picture, and a woman who works for National NAGPRA in DC. We're writing a paper about duty of care, and that duty of care is very important, especially when dealing with toxicity in collections and forms of contamination. But my piece of the paper argues that contamination toxicity also happens when you cross liminal boundaries, when objects and people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. That creates kinds of violence, it creates emotion, and that's the anthropological missing piece that people don't understand from NAGPRA compliance. That to understand fully why it is that a tribal member would say, I don't want a woman coming down into the collections with me, you have to understand all of this kind of liminality, in Mary Douglas terms even. And I also borrow from Garrett's in what I wrote about in the book I wrote on indigeneity. There's something people concentrate a lot on what does it mean to be Indian in terms of DNA, and you know, certificate of Indian blood. There's also indigeneity. We can talk about it as a force, as a cultural force that becomes global, that is rooted in, it doesn't have to be rooted in wannabiness or whatever, but it means that understanding our history well means understanding the indigenous histories that came before. And so this kind of force, the way that Gertz defines it, it guides people's activities. And it's used, it was used by Kara Krumpotich when her study of the Haida people and the Haida of Canada's repatriation efforts with Field Museum and Pitt Rivers and British Museum. She talks about the force, and I like that as something to think about. And then grief. Finally, my last thing is that many times there's criticism and gaslighting regarding how long it's taking tribal people to get on the stick and responding to museum queries about the objects that they need to know. And I don't think people don't realize how sorrowful this practice is. This is about death, desecration, alienation, disrespect, everything that you can think of. And when NAGPRA practitioners, especially, it's hard on all of us. Some of us wonder, like, wow, you know, at Fort Lewis College, there are 4 archaeology faculty or anthropology faculty members who are women, and 3 of those women got breast cancer. And a tribal member says, well, what do you expect with what's been going on there? And so it's hard on everybody. And when tribal people come for consultation, they're just as worried about us as we are about them. They're like, especially like, none of you are pregnant, are you? Have you been feeling okay? Are you eating right? You need to protect yourself with smudging, which protects yourself from unknown factors. And so the emotional elements, which are deemed as non-scientific, are extremely important and are part of the doing of the work. And that's why these communities of practice have been so important, because nothing has become less scientific by any means, but science is part of a system, and that system includes the world. So I wrote an article about this in a book I edited with Steve Rubenstein about border crossings. And in this article, I talk about the difference between North American Native attitudes about seeing the dead or dead bodies and those of some South American people, because you can go into museums in Cusco, for instance, and see mummies propped up. And so I look at that more deeply in this. But I quote from James Mooney, who's one of my heroes from the Ghost Dance and the Ghost Dance doctrine. And that's why I think that this is continuing some of Mooney's Ghost Dance work to think about NAGPRA. And then one final thing here, everyone's talking about reconciliation. And there's this wonderful collection that came out of Europe on irreconciliation, a special journal of the RAI, which has to do with, and so, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, key elements that pertain to NAGPRA are documentation, accountability, memorialization, what do we do so this doesn't happen again, reparations, and making reforms. So these are key to TRC commissions, and they're key to doing NAGPRA. But I see irreconciliation is really important to NAGPRA, and what I said earlier, which is this isn't going to ever end. And nobody should ever say, oh, Fort Lewis College, you're doing such a good job. We're going to bring out some drums and some ribbon skirts and do a land acknowledgement and say it's all good. It's never all good. We have irreconciliation means we recognize that reparations can be made, but we don't reconcile to saying it's all over with. And I think that's connected to this idea of survivance, which is a non-passive idea that Gerald Visenor and other Native authors have written about. So acknowledging what we've done, remaining vigilant, remaining active, and doing what people are saying in these communities of practice meeting now. It's like the government can cut all the funds they want, but we're going to keep working on NAGPRA. So I'm doing some things for Mesa Verde because their funding was cut for travel to help with a repatriation project just on my own dime in my own car. I'm just doing it. And that's what, I'm not going to reconcile myself to what the federal government is saying, that we have to do to be good citizens. So this is just the last slide. I taught a NAGPRA honors class back in 2015. And Stephanie Left Hand, who went on, got her master's at Baylor, she's Dene, she said, this is not luxury, this is survival. This is about sovereignty and cultural property. So, blah, blah, blah. Do you have any questions? I'll get out of this now. I hope this wasn't too much.
Wow. Wow. That's a whole lot to absorb in a short period. I mean, you had you just know so much. It's amazing. All that you've done and everything is just really exciting. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that I have didn't hear about ever before, but I think you stirred our brains to come up with all kinds of questions, issues. And I'm going to let Alice go first because Alice,
Mhm. Thank you.
you have a lot to say about this topic, I think. So go ahead.
Well, just two things I want to say. One is it's been so wonderful knowing Kathy all these years now. She is to me like a deep well that is always full of the most pure and healthful water. And if you can drink from this wonderful deep well, looks so modest, but she's so deep. That is so appreciative. The other thing that I want to say is there's one word that I have seen as critical and not discussed, and that is the word decolonization. Decolonization, look at it as a word in the English language. So what you see over and over again, there are book titles about decolonizing our work, decolonizing archaeology, and so on. Decolonization means there is a agent, the noun subject, that's doing something, the verb, to something or someone, the noun object. Who is the subject actor? Almost exclusively a white person, a settler colonist descendant. Who are the subject objects? Non-white, non-Euro descendant, frequently not as highly educated. So it is decolonization, is a perpetuation of the whole problem where white professional people do something to non-white, non-high class, high social class people. It's the same basic position of the white agent doing something to the subject object. So I hate the word decolonization, and I wish it was simply never used. And I sincerely hope it becomes more discussed as the epitome of this whole problem that NAGPRA was designed to address. So thank you.
Okay, Kathy, do you want to comment on Alice's notes?
Yeah, I hate the word too. And I use it because, as I said, I give talks to Native people, and it's kind of like required that you use the word, which is an irony.
Yeah,
And whole courses are centered around this. And um, there is an article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor that I like a lot. And I would like to get rid of it and just give it back. What we should be doing is not talking about decolonization and having it be a linguistic matter, but I see NAGPRA as truly um, uh, to giving back bodies and belongings, and we should be giving back lands that were taken as well. And that's why land acknowledgements are not good. So I'm trying to think of another word. I don't like that word. I have friends who don't like that word, but it's become so de rigueur, especially with Native studies programs. You kind of have to use it, or somebody asks you why you didn't. Yeah. Thank you, Alice. Thank you for your comments. I was just talking about you yesterday over coffee with Phil Duke about the time he spent with you in Crete. So it's nice to see you.
Kathy, I had a quick question. What have you come across situations where there are conflicts between tribal members or tribal communities over particular objects or cultural representation of a commodity that was produced or some funerary remains? Um, how does that play out in your experience with regard to the NAGPRA issues of cultural um,
That's
repatriation and so forth?
Thanks, Tim. That's an important question. It happens all the time. And that's one of the things and one of the dangers of talking about Native people, tribes, whatever. Every tribal group, which is an imposed term that came from the Romans, that's another one we'd like to get rid of. Um, and yet it's part of federal law. So tribes themselves use that rule, although no tribes have a word in tribal language for a tribe, but um, as a tribe per se. And disagreements happen. They happen between subgroups. They happen between individuals. And the thing is, they're expected to work those out themselves. So when notices of inventory completion are made that are published in the Federal Register, if there are multiple groups that are listed and they don't agree, they have to get together and decide. And if they can't come to a decision, they can take that to the NAGPRA review committee to help kind of arbitrate it, but really it's up to them. And it doesn't happen, in my experience, it hasn't happened near as often as people thought it would. And there are tribal coalitions that have been formed. The Pueblos pretty much have it's shifted now, but it used to be that final decisions regarding those kinds of matters would go to Hopi and Zuni people. The Apaches have created a coalition. The Muskogee Creek have taken the lead. And so the idea is to resolve those, but there are few right now. The issues that I know about are in the Southwest, and they remain in the Southwest between the Hopi and Navajo, and goes back to a federal the Hopi Navajo joint use area, which was a problem created by the federal government. And that has created problems to where sometimes they won't attend meetings if they know the other is there. And so those kind of problems just continue. So I don't have a good answer, but under the law, there's no mechanism to resolve that.
So if a museum wants to repatriate some item and it could be claimed by two groups, the NAGPRA has no authority to determine who would get the group, who would get the items.
No.
Okay. Yes, Sabra, yes.
Okay, I had a lot of questions, but I also have something interesting to say about the reputation of Native Americans globally, because my son went to, I don't know, have you ever heard of Rojava in northern Syria? It's they think of themselves, I think, in a way as if as simulating something like Native Americans in the States, in that they're an entity within a country that's of it in and of itself, and they managed to survive because they were everything um, everything that an activist like my son would like: feminist, all languages accepted in school, to be taught in school, which is an issue Syria had with the Ottoman Empire. Yes, all religions, they're Christian and Yazidi and Muslim. And so when my son went there secretly, a lot of people were going there to try to help them defend against invasion by ISIS. And so, and the Kurdish as well, language and culture. And so they bonded together basically to preserve all their small villages and towns in that area. And so anybody that came in to volunteer to help with the people the Rojavans that were already there, they had to go to an academy at first to make sure that they understood what they were doing and why they had come, or they couldn't stay because they all had been snuck in. So anyway, so the commander of the camp was a Yazidi man, and Yazidis especially were targeted by ISIS because Yazidis, although their religion is one God, they're not in the Abrahamic tradition, so they don't have that protection from the Yazidis. So anyway, this Yazidi commander asked my son for books about Native Americans, and they had particular books, and I can't remember now. I actually did send him one of the books. I mean, I emailed it as an attachment. And I think other places in the world too, they elevate Native Americans in terms of the kind of governmental organization that they have. And I just wanted to mention that. I mean, it's too complicated to go on and on about, but I think there's a place in Mexico also that's a place that is elevating Native American. They're not necessarily Native Americans, but I mean, some of them are in Mexico, Native American. But I just thought it was fascinating that how we think everybody thinks of the American government as, globally, as what represents the US. But in fact, there are all these other things going on among the populations in the US that are looked at as more interesting or more able to be learned from than the government, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yep.
So,
Okay, Kathy, did you want to say anything?
No, it's so complicated, and we could go down that path of everything from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Native people serving as a model that's ignored for women's rights and everything else but that's nation states wipe out those histories. That's so, the Ottoman Empire in a lot of ways is a tragic situation because of the diversity that completely disappeared under various fundamentalisms and the growth of nation states backed by then later oil interests, multinational. Anyway, yeah, nice comment.
Yeah, it's really, it's too, I just wanted to bring it up because at some point, maybe I could find out what that book was that they wanted, that he requested. And I'd have to go back, I think it was 2017 when my son was over there. And, yeah, uh, yeah,
Maybe they're talking about Jack Weatherford's book, where he was looking at ways that Native American political systems influenced the United
Yeah.
States. It could be, maybe it's that.
well,
Okay,
I
yes.
think it was because it was an entity within a country, but separate from, but trying to be not like the rest of the country.
Suzanne?
I was distracted by something here for a few minutes, but if you haven't already talked about it, could you say something more about the violence to knowledge? I was fascinated by that phrase that you used. I've been following all this, renaming of Krober Hall and all this, and I'm wondering how you see the relationship, how you see this as part of the story.
Well, it comes up a lot in consultation where the information that we need to know about relationships between territories, people, and places, when that's erased, and that happens with the people I work with in Ecuador as well, when that's hidden, erased, whitewashed, that's a form of violence. It's a form of violence to continuity, to claims. So people can't make claims even under current constitutions because of that. And it's violence in the sense that when you can't make a claim to territory, to recognition, to justice, that can cause bodily harm, psychological harm. And just for many of us who love thought, it's a kind of violence when we find out. I had students at college who I'd teach the most basic thing about history of African American, Native American, and they were angry and in tears. Like, why didn't we know this? Why weren't we told this? Do people think we're stupid? Do people think, which is a kind of violence, like felt they weren't worthy of knowing, and that's going to happen. It's happening now
More and more.
more than ever. So yeah, it's a kind of when what it means to be a person is to know things well that are connected and in embodied theory with feminism and so forth, it causes physical harm as well as emotional, cultural, linguistic, to lose a language completely. People who talk about, I don't know that, I used to know that, elders in tribal situations, it hurts me. And they talk about it as a kind of hurt. So I think we could explore it in a million different ways as a.
The reason I asked is I've been listening to these conversations at meetings about like Krober doing salvage anthropology, salvage linguistics, and then getting blamed for the problems. I mean, it seems to me sort of sad and ironic that he's used as a scapegoat for the problems. Where actually he was just trying to pick up the pieces and put some things together. I don't
Well,
know.
I think with, Krober and Boas and all of them, again, I don't like presentist approaches that apply values and standards and desires of the present onto the actions of people in the past. But there were some things that people in the past did that they should have known better.
Oh, that's true. No
and
question about it.
so yeah, I mean, one can condemn many things that Krober did and that Boas did, but to wipe them completely from history is a kind of a violence to
That's what I was
Yeah.
thinking about. Yeah. I was listening. I went to a group, I think it was in October. I went to a little group of, no, anyway, it was some meeting, answer meeting where there were a group of students who were talking about how they were relearning their languages, their Native American languages. And they started all this with a discussion about how horrible anthropologists have been. And then I said, where are you getting your information about your language? And they said, oh, from the Smithsonian. I'm thinking, well, who put it there? You know, there's no balance in this picture.
Right. And I've written about this before. I published an article where I talked about how anthropology has become kind of a trope itself. You can't say we hate history. Let's get rid of history. Let's get rid of philosophy. So the discipline of anthropology has come to stand in for many wrongs of Western
Yes, that's
civic
what's
system.
bothering me.
It doesn't bother me so much.
You're getting blamed for
It's a phase, and people are on top of it, like Herb or whoever, to like, let's stay on track. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Got it.
But
Yeah,
I think it's understandable
it
and
is. I agree. Very much so.
so much.
If I can, since you mentioned me, um, it's more than don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The fact is that so little is actually known and understood of the past that it's absolutely a scandal. And the book that I have just published, Correcting the Record, Essays on the History of American Anthropology, tries to really get down to basics here about what was going on with studies of American Indians and the languages, and even the extent to which Kroeber was condemned. I do recommend that you look at Andrew Garrett's book on the unnaming of Kroeber Hall, who goes into great detail and comes up saying, Garrett is a linguist who's worked with California languages, and says he was not guilty. He does think that it was okay to take the name off, but that Kroeber was not guilty of the things that he was accused of. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Mooney and the ghost dance. I know that Alice has written a whole book about it. And I must say that my chapter 2 in Correcting deals with this whole business of colonialism and American anthropology, and with salvage anthropology, and obviously gives salutes to Mooney. So I do hope that you'll be able to get a look at the book and consider recommending it to your friends, because I think I really do have some important things to say there on this also.
Thanks, Herb.
Can
Rick?
I
Rick?
break in here?
Let's Rick and then Alice, okay? Rick and then Alice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, first, thank you, Kathy, for a very impressive presentation. You mentioned a lot of things that I'd love to talk to you about sometime, not right now, but I'd love to know more about your experience in Ecuador, for example. My son spent a year living in Ambato, in the Ecuadorian highlands. But I was wondering about is the changes that we're seeing in the administration on the national level. And I'm just wondering what kind of effect that has been having on NAGPRA. You mentioned a couple of things, but I'm wondering if you can give us a broader view of the changes that are currently taking place.
Well, just real quickly, we don't know very much. We're and in fact, this Friday is going to be, there's every once a month on Friday, National NAGPRA office has a webinar. So it'll be one tomorrow at 11 o'clock to answer anybody's questions at all in the chat, but also to clarify what's going on with the regulations and so forth. They're pretty much, okay, just quickly, Trump has not gone after them yet. Or the new Secretary of Interior. Their staff has not been cut yet, but at what's central to NAGPRA compliance is publishing notices of inventory completion in the Federal Register, and their ability to publish, I forget the term that's used, like their ability to directly publish to the Federal Register was removed. So now they have to go through a third party. So there was a big backlog where hundreds of notices were stymied. Now those are starting to move through using this other process. The NAGPRA grants for consultation and documentation that are statutory, there's a fear that those are going to be stopped. And also the repatriation grants, but there hasn't been any, the ones that are in place right now have not been lifted. And if there were, there would be a lawsuit because those grants are statutory. They are required under the law itself. But because there's so much NAGPRA work to do, and because it can't just be covered by the budget, the meager budget of the NAGPRA office, lots of institutions have turned to the National Endowment for Humanities, to the IMLS, Museums and Library Association, and those grants have all been cut completely. And so there's a lot of work. So there's a lot of fear there. But right now, the National NAGPRA office with its staff of 8 people is still functioning. And that's all we know. It's day to day.
Thank you.
Alice, go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow directly on Herb because in archives, there are probably innumerable letters, personal notebook entries, and so on from the first century professional anthropology, shall we say, you know, Kroeber and so on. And you see over and over in the correspondence of Boaz with the field workers for the Jessup expedition, for example, is that who is to blame for all the desecration, all the robbing of graves, all the horrible taking of skulls in front of the grandchildren of the deceased. Horrible. But who is to blame? Oligarch, Morris Jessup. There is a lot of correspondence between Jessup and Boaz, who was a recent hire at the American Museum, and his job was in jeopardy. And Morris Jessup said to him, Boaz, I can fire you right away. I'm thinking of doing it. I'm going to cut all the funds for the Jessup expedition from Northwestern America and Northeastern Asia. I'm going to cut these funds. And Boaz is saying, my field workers don't want to bring in skulls from graves. And Jessup said, I want to have the best collection of American Indian skulls in my museum, the American Museum. Do you hear me? If you don't do it, I'll hire somebody else. This is all in writing in the archives, so that we right now are seeing an oligarch who is among the worst that has ever been in North America, that's for sure. And he is using his power to destroy American democracy and the Constitution. There were oligarchs back in the Gilded Age. God knows that's why it's called that. There have been oligarchs all along. And they are the ones whose names ought to be taken off buildings. The building that used to be called Kroeber Hall still has a section inside, which still has the name of Phoebe Apperson Hearst, Mrs. William Randus Hearst. Yeah, that's enough to say. Oh, I do want to add one thing. Talking about our own history. 1975, Morton Freed's book, The Notion of Tribe. I don't see it referred to. So 1975, Morton Freed, Notion of Tribe. It tells a very great deal in depth about this whole issue of calling them tribes instead of nations. Thank you.
Okay, good. Kathy, I had a quick question, and this has to do with your experience as a scholar of indigeneity in Ecuador and your experience in the Southwest with First Nations of the U.S. and Southwest. So, since I've worked in Peru and I work in Guatemala, the issues having to do with places where there are majority indigenous populations, such as Ecuador and Peru, Bolivia, um, and Guatemala, Mexico. The issues having to do with um, things associated with repatriation, et cetera. Do you detect some kind of a qualitative difference in the concerns and issues that indigenous peoples of Peru, Ecuador, in the highlands, I'm particularly referring to, as opposed to the lowlands, uh, Brazil's indigenous people, First Nations people wouldn't fit into what I'm thinking about. But do you detect a qualitative difference between the concerns about repatriation issues between those peoples, highland peoples of Central and South America, with those of Native Americans of the Southwest?
Well, if you mean by qualitative cultural differences in how much they respect their ancestors or how troubled they are that their belongings have been taken elsewhere, no, I think they're all very similar from what I know, but the differences in terms of their ability to organize politically and institutionally to ask for the return are very much colored by the difference in their colonial histories and the fact that the difference between Anglo-based countries based on treaties and those, there are none in South America except among the Mapuche, who had a treaty with Spain. There's very different, and there's a hierarchy of concerns. They're also discriminated against, lots of poverty and so forth. And so territorial issues and issues over land and water and oil, especially in Ecuador. When the CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous People of Ecuador, was first formed, its original platform statement had as a platform item the return of ancestors that are in museums, something like that. And that went by the wayside because there were just so many other things in their face. And now it's coming back to talk about this again. It came up in the chapter I wrote about Argentina, where the guy, what's his name, from National Geographic, went up to the highest spot in Argentina and excavated mummies and brought them down, and they were displayed. They built a museum just for them in northern Argentina. And Native people, based partly on the internet, in connecting with Native people in other parts of the world to find out that this is a global movement, they protested. And so that museum was not open for a long time. And I think it's only like provisionally open now. So, there's lots of things. Native people are, ever since the quincentenary and the opening of the internet, Native people have been able to communicate with each other more and find some common ground. But in terms of the basics, you don't want your history destroyed. You don't want your language destroyed. Though that's common to all people everywhere, indigenous or not.
Mhm. Okay, very interesting. So we're coming down to the end. I have time for one last question if there's anybody who has a question. Is that Suzanne? Is that you? Yes? No?
No,
No?
well, thank you. I really
Okay.
like this talk very much.
Okay.
I
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Okay.
Thanks
All
to
right.
all of you. I'm just tickled to be here, and I've met some of you in person now, and Margot and I went to DePauw, and we just found that out. So there's all these things. I had lunch with Push, and so it's like it's just great to see you all. And again, Alice, just talking about her yesterday with Phil Duke. So it's Been a privilege. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kathy. This has been a really fascinating talk, and wow, you just have a wealth of information. So if we have any more questions about NAGPRA, we know who to contact.
And I appreciate it because I'm working on, I've got the, and Alice knows this, but I've gotten the approval and encouragement from my editor at Nebraska, who's Alice's editor, to do a revised edition of Grave Injustice, the book I published in 2002. And I have a person, a native of Choctaw museum specialist who's going to write a chapter for that. So any questions you've posed or anything you think of I'm just now getting going on the revision. So could very well, and I was scribbling stuff you were saying today. So thank you very much for contributing to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and hope to see you again next month. Okay. My speaker for next month just emailed me today saying family emergency came up. So I'm going to be, if you have any suggestions for someone to talk for May, please contact me as soon as possible. And Kathy, if there's a group of anybody who is in your group that might be interested in talking, particularly a person from the First Nations communities, it would be wonderful as a good follow-up to today's talk. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you when we see you next time, hopefully next month. Take care. Thank you very much,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.